On September 4th, 2018, around 4:25 in the afternoon, I was cycling a narrow dirt lane between two small villages outside Cluj-Napoca. I had left too late, and the weather turned faster than I expected. The sky sagged with thick clouds that pressed the light down into something closer to dusk than late day. The air smelled sharp, like cold metal, and the wind kept shifting against my face in uneven bursts. The countryside around me was mostly empty fields stitched together with patches of forest. The road itself felt more like a long scar through the hills than an actual route people relied on. I kept pedaling, trying to ignore the faint vibration of thunder I thought I heard somewhere behind me. I still had about 5 kilometers to go before reaching the guest house where I was staying. It was one of those family-run places on the outskirts of a village, the type with a friendly yard and chickens that wandered across the grass. I'd felt confident setting out earlier, but now the sky looked as if the sun had already dropped behind the horizon. My legs were beginning to ache from the slow uphill stretches. The air grew heavier, the color of everything flattening into grainy gray. The first bus stop appeared at a bend where the trees opened up briefly. It was nothing more than a cracked concrete bench under a sheet metal roof that had been dented in 2 corners. Graffiti covered the metal in faded black spray paint. An old woman sat on the bench, wearing a red headscarf tied tight around her chin. She clutched a white plastic shopping bag against her stomach. Her boots were pushed close together, toes pointing inward. Something about her posture made her look stranded, like someone who had been waiting too long. I nodded as I cycled past, mostly out of habit, but she didn't seem to react. Her eyes flickered toward me for a split second, dark and flat, before looking away. The road curved sharply to the right, dipping slightly. I kept pedaling, focusing on the sudden drop in temperature. The clouds looked thicker now, as if they were stacking on top of one another. My shirt clung to my back. After about 30 seconds, I came up on another bend where the road rose again. I saw the second bus stop before I saw anything else, and for a second I thought my mind had drifted and looped the scenery. The structure looked identical, same dented sheet metal roof, same cracked concrete bench, even the same tangle of weeds at the base. It wasn't until I drew closer that I felt something tighten deep inside my stomach. The old woman was there again. Same red headscarf, same white plastic bag, same hunched posture, but her body was angled differently, facing the road more directly. This time she didn't look at me at all. Her head was tilted slightly, and her eyes were fixed on the field opposite the stop. She held the bag against her chest with both hands, knuckles pale against the plastic. I could see her fingers trembling in small, uneven movements. I slowed down without thinking. My front tire wobbled a little on the uneven dirt, and I steadied myself with one foot hitting the ground. I stared long enough to notice that even the graffiti on the metal roof seemed to match what I had seen at the first stop. It wasn't just similar, it looked exact. Same strokes, same fading. My throat went dry. The field she was staring at was empty except for tall grass moving under the wind, rippling in long sheets. The silence made everything feel closer, like the world had narrowed. I forced myself to keep going, pushing the bike forward with stiff legs. The wind shifted again and carried a smell like wet soil, even though it hadn't rained. I didn't look back. When the third bend came up, it happened so quickly that I barely registered the slope I was climbing. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. The road twisted around a dense cluster of trees, then opened into another small clearing, and there it was. A third bus stop, identical to the last 2 in every detail I could recognize. But this one was empty. The old woman wasn't sitting on the bench, yet something else was. The same white plastic shopping bag lay in the center of the concrete seat. It was crumpled and slightly deflated, as though it had been dropped or left in a hurry. The sight of it made my arms prickle. The top of the bag was pinched closed, but the thin sides rose and fell in a tiny, irregular motion, almost like slow breathing. I braked so hard the back wheel skidded sideways. The bike rattled beneath me. My mind tried to explain the moving bag with something simple. A small gust sneaking through, an animal trapped inside, the pressure of cooling air, but none of those thoughts settled. The movement had been too smooth, too deliberate. I got off the bike, leaning it against my hip. My legs felt unreliable, like they weren't fully my own. The air was heavy with an electric stillness that made my scalp tighten. I walked slowly toward the bus stop, keeping my eyes on the bag. Each step felt too loud on the packed dirt. My breathing sounded wrong in the quiet, like it didn't belong. When I reached the bench, the bag abruptly went still. Completely still. The kind of stillness that felt intentional. I stopped a meter away, aware of how exposed I was on that empty road. The cracked concrete bench looked more worn up close. The graffiti, again, was the same pattern. It was impossible not to notice the repeated details, the same chipped corner of the roof, the same dark streak of rust down the left support bar. I felt disoriented, as though something had folded the road back on itself without moving me. I reached out very slowly toward the bag, more to force myself to do something than from any real desire to touch it. Just as my fingers were a few centimeters away, a roar of sound burst behind me. A bus shot past so close that the blast of hot air slapped the entire right side of my body. The metal of the vehicle was dull yellow, streaked with grime. I hadn't heard an engine, hadn't heard tires on the road, hadn't heard anything until it was already beside me. The bus didn't slow. It didn't even ease around the bend ahead. It sped through the clearing and vanished around the curve like it was running a route only it understood. The smell of exhaust hung thick for a moment, then faded into the cold wind. My heart hammered against my ribs. My first instinct was to get back on the bike and ride as fast as I could, but my eyes were still fixed on the bag. The rush of the bus had made it shift slightly, rolling just enough to open the edge of the plastic. Inside, I could see something pale through the thin material, fabric maybe. I leaned closer and realized it was a folded shirt, a child's size, printed with little yellow moons. Next to it was a small plastic bottle of water, still sealed, and an unopened package of biscuits. The type sold in corner shops for kids' lunches. Nothing else. Nothing that explained the earlier movement. A gust of wind came from the opposite direction, pushing the bag over onto its side. The contents rolled out just enough to scatter slightly, but didn't spill further. I noticed then that the bench was dusty except for a clean rectangular patch where someone had been sitting recently, the outline still sharply defined. Something clicked in my mind. The old woman's posture, the way she held the bag to her chest as though guarding it, the trembling fingers, the way she stared across the field instead of down the road. I had seen too many roadside memorials on empty rural routes not to recognize the signs of someone returning to a place tied to a private loss. The identical bus stops weren't supernatural, they were part of these villages. The same design, same materials, same contractor. I had been traveling longer than I thought between them, and the strange light of the storm made everything blend together in a way that shrank distance. The woman had simply taken a different footpath between the stops, or someone else who resembled her had been waiting ahead. My mind had filled in the rest under the pressure of the coming storm. The bag moving had likely been nothing more than trapped warm air escaping when I approached. A simple expansion and collapse under changing pressure. The breathing effect was just my nerves imposing rhythm on random motion. The bus I hadn't heard could be explained by the wind direction and the muffling slope behind me. It was a real route, and I happened to be standing too close to the lane, my attention fixed on the bag. Everything added up when I forced my mind to lay the pieces out logically. But even with that clarity, the atmosphere didn't ease. The hollow feeling in my chest stayed, as though the landscape itself had pressed inward. The road felt strange now, unsettling in a way I couldn't shake. I picked up the shirt and the biscuits and placed them back inside the bag, tightening the handles so it wouldn't blow away. I left it exactly where it had been. Whatever story it belonged to wasn't mine to disturb. I got back on my bike, my legs trembling slightly, and pedaled hard toward the guest house. The road behind me stayed silent. The wind kept pushing at my back, and I didn't look over my shoulder again. The sky finally opened 20 minutes later, rain falling in a sudden sheet, but by then the lights of the village were close enough to see through the blur. I rode the last stretch soaked and exhausted, unable to shake the feeling of that silent road, the repeated bus stops, and the old woman's fixed stare across the field. It wasn't anything supernatural. It was just the uneasy recognition that some places hold their stories tightly, and sometimes you pass through them at the wrong moment, seeing more than you meant to. During the Eid holidays in May 2022, I stayed with a friend in his village near Chakwal. His family's house was full of visiting relatives, the kind of crowd that fills every room and every corner. By the second night, the noise felt heavy, and when someone suggested that a few of us sleep in the orchard to get fresh air, the idea seemed perfect. The orchard sat a short walk down a dirt path behind the house, a small patch of trees that his family had tended for years. It was familiar to them, but new to me, and the mix of dust, grass, and ripening fruit gave the place a scent that felt older than anything in the city. We carried our cots down after dinner and set them in a loose row near the center, where the ground was even and the branches above let us see the sky. By the time the lights from the house went quiet, the orchard was still. The others drifted off quickly, tired from the long day. I lay awake on my cot, staring through the open weave of the mosquito net at the branches above me. The night felt wider in the village, as if everything had more room to breathe. The hum of insects filled the space between the trees. Far in the distance, the motorway gave off a low, steady drone, so soft it felt like it was coming through the ground rather than the air. The soil beneath my cot held a trace of warmth from the day, but the breeze brushing over me carried the sharp edge of cooler air sliding down from the surrounding hills. For a long time nothing changed. The stars stayed fixed between the leaves. The boys' breathing stayed deep and even. The scent of the orchard wrapped around everything like a blanket. I kept tracing the outlines of branches, trying to follow their shapes as they overlapped against the dim sky. At some point, I noticed a faint interruption on the ridge behind the orchard. It looked like a small flash, brief and soft, like a phone flashlight pointed downward, turned on and off as someone walked. At first it didn't catch my attention as anything unusual. Teenagers from nearby houses roamed around sometimes, and I assumed it was just someone cutting across the ridge on their way home. The flashes weren't rhythmic. They came in uneven intervals, sometimes close together, sometimes with long gaps. I tried to track the path of the light by watching how it moved against the line of the hill. That was when I felt the first tug of uncertainty. The ridge sloped down from left to right, but the light didn't follow that shape. It stayed at a steady height, as if whoever carried it was walking on flat ground, not climbing or descending. It seemed off by only a small degree at first, something easy to ignore. But as the light continued moving, the mismatch became clearer. It kept drifting horizontally, slipping behind one tree trunk and reappearing beside another, moving in a way that didn't match the slope of the land. I lifted my head slightly from the cot to get a better angle. The mosquito net brushed my forehead. The others didn't stir. Their blankets rose and fell with slow breaths. The orchard felt tighter now, as if the distance between each tree had shrunk. The flashing grew steadier, though not brighter. Each time it appeared between the branches, it had the cold, white glare of an LED light. It wasn't the warm type villagers used in lanterns. This was the same harsh tone most phones gave off. It didn't sway like a lantern either. It simply turned on, turned off, and then came back again in a slightly different position. I waited for the sound of footsteps on the ridge. The ground there was rocky, and anyone climbing it usually kicked loose pebbles down the slope. But nothing reached me. Even the insects seemed quieter the longer I listened. The light dropped lower over the next few minutes, though I couldn't tell how. It didn't tilt or widen the way a beam would if someone descended a hill toward us. It just reappeared each time closer to the height of the orchard floor. I told myself someone could be taking a narrow shortcut I didn't know about. Maybe they were walking behind the trees in a way that hid their steps. But the orchard's lower ground was uneven. Anyone moving through it should have made some noise, branches snapping, leaves brushing, soil shifting. Instead, the night held its breath. When the light reached the last row of trees behind us, I felt a jolt of responsibility, like the moment when you realize everyone else is asleep and you're the only one awake enough to notice something wrong. It wasn't fear yet, just a growing pressure under my ribs. I shifted slightly on my cot to look at my friend, half hoping he would sense my movement and wake. He only rolled onto his side, pulling the blanket over his shoulder. The small change in position made the cot creak softly, and the sound felt too loud in the quiet. I looked back toward the trees. The blinking had stopped. A single white glare hovered between two trunks, about 15 meters away, at the height of an adult's chest. It was sharper than before, aimed directly toward the line of cots. I waited for a silhouette to appear behind it, a shoulder, a head, any hint of a person holding the light, but the beam floated in front of the dark shapes of the branches with nothing attached to it. No outline, no movement that suggested a hand or wrist adjusting its angle. The beam began drifting from left to right, passing over each sleeping boy. As it crossed their faces, it carved out every detail. The crease of a brow, the faint sheen of sweat near the hairline, the curve of a jaw resting against an arm. Each face glowed for a moment, then dimmed as the beam slid onward. I stayed still, waiting for the glare to hit me as well. But it never did. It stopped just short of my cot, resting on the thin strip of ground between me and the next one. The light held there, unmoving. I could feel how exposed I was, my arms outside the blanket, my chest rising and falling within the faint net of the cot. I tried to steady my breath without making it too shallow, thinking that any sudden shift might draw the glare to me. The hovering remained steady, but the air around it seemed denser, like the temperature had dropped slightly in that small circle of ground. I started forcing myself to think through explanations instead of letting panic take shape. Someone could have left a phone on, maybe hung it on a branch, though the steady aim of the beam made that unlikely. A drone seemed possible, but the orchard was silent, and a drone should have produced at least a faint mechanical buzz. The lack of sound bothered me more than the hovering itself. I waited for nearly a minute, not moving anything except my eyes. Eventually, the light dipped slightly, almost imperceptibly, and began to retreat the way it had come. It didn't blink this time. It stayed on as it glided back into the trees, slipping behind the trunks one by one until only thin slivers of glare peeked through. Then those vanished too. I stayed awake until the first gray light of dawn leaked over the horizon. The others woke gradually, stretching, yawning, complaining about mosquito bites. I scanned the ground where the beam had stopped, expecting some dropped object or trace of movement. The soil looked untouched. No footprints, no dragged branches, nothing disturbed. Later that morning, while heading back to the house, I walked up the ridge to check the line where the flashes had first appeared. The slope was rough and loose, covered with dry brush. Anyone climbing it would have had to plant their feet carefully. There was no direct path from there to the orchard floor, without making noise. I followed the possible routes twice, stopping to listen each time. Every step I took produced a crunch or scrape. When I returned to the orchard, I noticed something I had missed before. The last tree the hovering beam passed behind had a low, broken branch that jutted out at chest height. On the tip of it hung a thin fishing line, almost invisible in daylight, caught on the bark. It stretched toward the next tree, but ended abruptly where it had snapped. Near the base of the trunk lay a small spool, half covered in dirt, like it had been dropped in a hurry. The line itself had been pulled tight in the direction of the ridge, creating a narrow guide straight toward where the light had hovered. It became clear then that someone had threaded the line between several trees in a straight path, and used it to slide or pull something small and battery-powered, probably a phone or light module. The irregular flashes matched the movement of a device being tugged along uneven tension. The silent approach made sense too. Whoever operated it remained on the ridge, out of sight, dragging the line by hand. The hovering in front of us was the result of the line snagging on the broken branch, leaving the light suspended until it was pulled free again. The idea of someone watching from the ridge unsettled me more than anything. Someone had approached the orchard knowing we were sleeping there, someone willing to set up a path of fishing line across the trees in the dark. It wasn't an accident or a passing stranger. It was deliberate, patient, and silent. I never mentioned it to the others. The spool and the snapped line were enough explanation for me, but not enough comfort. Every time I remembered the way the beam had paused before reaching my cot, I felt the same pressure under my ribs. Not fear of the light itself, but of the person behind it, standing somewhere in the dark, pulling a thin line toward a group of sleeping boys, stopping only when it reached the place where I lay awake. On January 22nd, 2023, the drive to my aunt's cottage felt like it would never end. The storm that had rolled through earlier in the day had left the entire stretch of rural Vermont wrapped in a kind of muffled white darkness that seemed to swallow sound and distance. I had borrowed a Subaru for the trip, something with enough clearance to get through the back roads near Randolph, but the tires still slipped a little on the last few miles of packed snow. By the time I reached the narrow single-lane road leading toward the cottage, it was around 9:10 p.m. The snowbanks rose almost level with the windows, clean-edged walls sculpted by plows and drifting wind. The GPS had cut out nearly 10 minutes earlier, leaving me with nothing but memory and a vague sense of the turns ahead. The headlights pushed a pale tunnel through the pines. Everything outside the beam looked heavy and colorless, the weight of the dark sky pressing down on the trees until they seemed to fold inward. I kept one hand braced on the wheel as the road curved. The last time I had driven this way had been midsummer, and the same stretch of road that felt open and harmless then now felt like the inside of a long, cold throat. I spotted the red taillights before I realized what they were. They appeared through the falling snow as two faint, half-buried glows on the right shoulder, blinking in an uneven rhythm. I slowed instinctively, unsure if someone was still inside or whether the vehicle had been there since the storm started. As the Subaru rolled closer, the scene became clearer. A dark SUV skewed at an angle, nose down in the ditch, its rear tires lifted slightly by the slope. Snow had blown up against the back bumper and half covered the lights, muting them so they pulsed through a veil of white. I pulled up behind it and left my headlights on, illuminating the shape enough to see the driver's door hanging open. A thin ribbon of snow had drifted across the seat and onto the floor mat. The rest of the interior looked undisturbed, as though someone had stepped out and simply never returned. For a moment, I stayed in my car with the engine running, trying to listen for anything, voices, movement, even the shift of branches, but the only sound was the steady thump of my own hazard lights. I rolled down the window and leaned out, calling into the dark, hoping maybe someone had only just climbed out. There was no response, not even the echo of my own voice. It felt wrong to keep driving, so I put the Subaru in park and stepped out, letting the door stay open behind me. The air was sharp and metallic in my throat. My boots sank into the snow with a soft, hollow crunch as I walked toward the SUV. The footprints were easy to see. One set, clear and deep, leading from the driver's door around the front of the vehicle and into the trees. The stride looked steady, no sign of stumbling or running. Whoever had been in the SUV had left calmly, almost deliberately. I raised my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut a narrow bar through the trees where the tracks continued, straight and confident. I followed slowly, placing each step into the previous impressions, partly to keep from making more noise and partly to steady myself. The forest absorbed light strangely. The snow reflected the beam sharply for a few feet, then everything faded into thick shadow. But the prints remained visible, a crisp trail of ovals leading deeper between the pines. I expected some sign of where the person had gone, broken branches, a lighter patch of snow, anything that showed an actual path. Instead, the footprints simply ended. One step, then another, and then nothing but a smooth drift untouched by anything human. It was as if the person had stepped forward and vanished, leaving no disturbance in the fresh powder beyond that point. I stood there for several seconds, trying to make sense of it. The snow beyond the final print was flawless, not even a single depression or spray. The trees around me looked undisturbed, heavy with their loads of snow. There was no slope to suggest a fall, no concealed ditch, no thin ice. Just undisturbed white. The realization that the forest was entirely silent hit me slowly, like a weight settling on my shoulders. The wind had been brushing the treetops earlier, but here, deeper off the road, nothing moved. Not a single creak of branches or rustle of needles. Even the distant hum of my car's engine had faded to a faint, insulated murmur. I turned back toward the direction of the Subaru, the beam of my phone shaking slightly. The tall trees blurred together into the same repeating dark pillars, and for a moment I couldn't tell exactly which way I had come in from. When I finally spotted the glow of my headlights, they looked farther away than I remembered. As I started walking toward them, I felt something tighten in my gut. The snow around my boots didn't look right. I slowed and angled the flashlight down. My own footprints, the ones I had made walking from the car to this spot, were gone. In their place was a messy scatter of overlapping boot prints circling the tree I was standing beside. The pattern looked chaotic, as though someone had been pacing around the trunk again and again, sometimes close, sometimes drifting outward, always looping back. The snow where I should have seen my own clear trail was churned up, not violently, but with deliberate repetition. The boot prints were roughly the same size as mine, but the tread pattern was different, narrower, with a diagonal line through the center. I stepped back instinctively and felt my heel brush against the base of the tree. The cold bark pressed through my jacket. The overlapping prints formed almost a perfect ring around it, close enough that if someone had been walking those loops in the time I'd been standing there, I would have felt their presence brushing the air around me. I tried to count how many prints there were, but the snow was too disturbed. The repetition made the ground look like it had been trampled by one person pacing in circles for far longer than I could have stood there. A slow, sinking understanding settled in my chest. Someone had been out here with me, moving silently through the trees. Someone who had been watching the approach of my headlights, who had seen me get out of the car and follow the prints. Someone who had waited until I was deep enough in the woods that the road was no longer visible, then walked over my trail with calm, measured steps. I forced myself to start walking toward the headlights. Each step felt loud, like the crunch of my boots could draw something out from between the trees. I kept the flashlight aimed ahead, refusing to glance to either side. The sense of being watched tightened across my shoulders with every breath. When I reached the road, the Subaru sat exactly where I had left it, engine running, exhaust drifting upward in a soft plume. The SUV ahead of it blinked steadily, the red light pulsing against the snow. There were now new footprints around the back of my vehicle. Just a few, shallow ones leading from the tree line toward the road and stopping near the rear bumper. The tread matched the prints I had seen circling the tree. My first instinct was to get back into the driver's seat and lock the doors, but something on the SUV caught my attention. The trunk hatch was slightly ajar, maybe only an inch, but enough to show it hadn't been like that before. Snow had begun drifting into the seam. The tracks leading from the driver's door into the woods hadn't passed by the rear of the vehicle. Whoever had paced around me had come back toward the road separately, after I was already in the trees. I backed up slowly, not turning my back on either vehicle, opened the Subaru's door, and slid in. The interior felt too warm and too quiet. I locked the doors, shifted into drive, and eased past the SUV without letting the wheels dip into the ditch. The narrow road forced me to keep my speed low, but every instinct screamed to go faster. The headlights carved shaky lines through the forest ahead, and every few seconds I checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure appear between the trees. When I reached the intersection with the main road, the relief came so abruptly I felt dizzy. The plowed stretch of pavement looked oddly welcoming under the streetlight glow. I didn't stop until I reached my aunt's cottage, and even then I stayed in the car for a long moment before getting out. The air there wasn't silent. The wind moved through the bare branches, and the distant creek behind the cottage murmured against its banks. Ordinary sounds felt almost unbelievable after the deep, suffocating quiet of the woods. The next morning, once the sun was up, I called the local authorities to report the SUV. I explained exactly where it was and what I had seen, but left out the part about the footprints circling the tree. Saying it out loud felt too strange, too unlikely to be taken seriously. They told me they would look into it. No one called back. I didn't hear anything about a missing person from Randolph in the news, and I never learned who had been driving that SUV or why they had walked into the forest after dark. But for weeks afterward, whenever I went outside in fresh snow, I found myself checking the ground around me, making sure each print was my own, making sure none of them circled closer than they should. Just before midnight on May 9th, 2022, I was riding shotgun in my friend's 1998 Corolla, heading back toward Narrowell after a long day that had slipped later than either of us planned. The air was thick with early summer humidity, the kind that clings to the skin and makes every movement feel slow. The windows were cracked an inch to let in whatever breeze the motion of the car could create, carrying the mixed smells of damp soil, warm asphalt, and faint fertilizer from the surrounding rice fields. The only consistent sound was the engine's steady hum and the occasional chirp from insects hidden somewhere in the dense green on either side of the raised canal road. The canal ran along the right side of the asphalt, maybe a meter or two below road level, a long ribbon of black water with no lamps or houses anywhere nearby. The left side opened onto wide fields, tall and dark, the stalks moving in loose waves under a breeze I couldn't feel. There was no moon, just a low haze that reflected the distant glow of towns far off, giving the sky a faint brownish cast. It was the kind of road where you could go 10 minutes without seeing another pair of headlights, and neither of us had passed anyone since leaving the village market. We had been laughing about old horror films, nothing serious, just passing time. I remember leaning back, letting the seatbelt edge rest against my chest, feeling almost comfortable despite the darkness. Then the tone in the car shifted without a word. My friend eased off the accelerator at the same moment I noticed him leaning forward, shoulders tense, hands tightening on the steering wheel. The engine softened to a low whine, and the headlights stretched farther ahead on the empty road. About 50 meters in front of us, a white Suzuki pickup sat parked sideways across the asphalt, completely blocking it. The hazard lights were off. There were no reflectors catching our beams. The placement was wrong in a way that immediately scraped at my nerves. No attempt at pulling to the side, no sign of an accident, just a deliberate perpendicular stop as if it had been dropped there. As we rolled closer, more details sharpened. The pickup's doors were open, all of them, drivers, passengers, and both rear. 2 blue plastic crates lay on the road, one cracked on the corner. Their contents were scattered in messy arcs across the asphalt. Tomatoes, dozens of them, rolled slowly across the slight slope toward the canal. They bumped softly against each other and left faint wet streaks when the skins split on the rough road surface. For a moment, with the high beams catching the glossy red skins, the scene almost looked staged. When the Corolla came to a stop, the headlights poured directly into the pickup's empty cabin. The seats were visible, fabric worn at the edges, nothing unusual except for a dark smear along the outside of the passenger door. It was long and uneven, trailing from the handle down toward the lower panel, as though someone with something wet on their hands had brushed against it. In the middle of the lane, placed oddly straight as if it hadn't been tossed, lay a single men's sandal. It was gray, the cheap foam kind sold at small shops, and it faced the wrong way, heel toward us. The air felt heavier when we stopped. Without the forward motion, the smells shifted. Damp earth mixed with the faint metallic tang of water, sitting still too long. The fields on the left were silent. Not even the rustle of leaves reached us. It was the kind of silence that seemed to wait for something. My friend leaned on the horn, the long blast breaking the stillness for a moment. The sound shot out across the fields and over the canal, but instead of echoing, it felt swallowed, dampened by the open space and the water below. When the noise faded, nothing replaced it. No voices calling back, no footsteps, no crack of movement in the crops. I opened the passenger door and put one foot on the asphalt. The air outside was warmer, carrying the smell of the tomatoes beginning to crush under their own weight. The road felt unnaturally still under me, like everything had paused. I leaned out a little, scanning the edges of the canal, the fields, the dark gaps between the scattered crates. Then from the canal side, maybe 10 meters off the road, I heard it. A wet, choking sound, slow and thick, like someone trying to clear mud from their throat, but unable to get enough breath between attempts. It didn't rise or fall, didn't break into coughs or gasps. It just continued with the same awful rhythm, bubbling and gargling as though a person was kneeling with their mouth full of water and trying to breathe through it. I froze with my hand on the door frame. The sound didn't move closer or farther. It stayed exactly where it had started, fixed in place in a patch of darkness that the headlights barely reached. I strained to hear more, the splash of shifting weight, the kick of a foot in water, anything that might match a living person struggling. But there was nothing, just that wet noise, steady as if coming from a broken pump under the surface. A strange realization crept over me. If someone were actually in the water, there would be ripples, splashes, the scrape of clothing. The canal wasn't deep right near the edge, and the reeds would rustle. But all I heard was the sound itself, with no movement around it. The water remained completely smooth, almost too smooth, reflecting a dull ribbon of our headlights. There was no disturbance, no sign of a body or even a submerged animal. I stepped back into the car slowly, lowering myself into the seat without taking my eyes off the canal. The gurgling noise continued, unbroken, as though unaware of us or uninterested. My chest tightened in a way I'd felt only once before, when I had come close to a roadside accident at night and wasn't sure if someone was pinned inside the wreck. That same rising instinct to leave as quickly as possible pressed hard in my throat. My friend didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He shifted the gear into reverse and began backing up the way we had come. The Corolla jerked slightly as the wheels rolled over a few tomatoes, but he kept a steady speed, careful and controlled, eyes locked on the road behind us through the rear windshield. I kept my face turned toward the canal, watching the strip of dark water slide past in the side mirror. The sound stayed with us longer than I expected. Even as the pickup shrank into the distance and the crates disappeared into the dark, the noise seemed to cling to the road, fading slower than it should, as if it were following the light rather than coming from a body. Eventually, the fields rose between us and the canal bend, and the sound thinned into a faint murmur before vanishing entirely. The moment it disappeared, the regular night sounds returned, the crickets, the distant hum of water flowing deeper in the canal, the soft wind moving across the crops. It felt almost normal again, but my hands were still shaking slightly in my lap. We didn't stop until we reached the main highway, where the first passing truck in nearly half an hour felt like a sign of actual life returning to the world. The bright lights, the engine noise, even the dust kicked up by its tires felt grounding after the strange stillness of that isolated stretch. Later, when I tried to make sense of what we saw, the details formed a picture I didn't want to consider at the time. A truck stopped sideways with doors open, crates spilled suddenly, as though dropped in a hurry. The dark smear on the door, which looked more like the residue left when someone wipes a dirty hand on a surface than anything dramatic. The sandal placed oddly straight, maybe lost during a quick step backward. And that sound unmoving, unchanging, too steady to be someone genuinely struggling. What made the most sense, after hours of replaying it in my head, was that something had gone wrong during a loading or unloading stop. Maybe a family or workers were moving crates when one of them slipped into the canal, not far from where the reeds grew thick. The canal had soft mud under the surface. Someone could sink knee-deep quickly. The gurgling could have come from a trapped person whose face was barely above water, making noise without much movement. People panic in silent ways, especially if the water is cold or they're exhausted. It would explain the lack of splashing, someone pinned or tangled, barely able to shift, producing only that awful rhythmic sound. The others, the people who had been in the pickup, might have gone for help, running toward a farmhouse or the main road, leaving everything open and scattered. They could have been far away by the time we arrived, desperate to find someone awake. The idea didn't comfort me, but it at least grounded the scene in something human, something tragic rather than inexplicable. I still think about that noise, though, not because it was mysterious, but because it was so steady. A person caught in mud or reeds, too exhausted to thrash, making the only sound their body could manage while waiting for someone to return. And we left. We didn't have the equipment or the knowledge to go down into a dark canal at midnight, but the weight of the decision stayed with me. The sound had stopped only because we had driven far enough away that the night finally smothered it. Since then, every time I pass a quiet roadside canal at night, I roll the window up, no matter how hot it is. If the water looks too still, I don't look directly at it. I keep my eyes on the road, hands tight on the seatbelt, and hope I never again hear something that forces me to imagine what might be struggling just out of sight, waiting for someone braver, or more desperate, than me. I spent the first week of August 2017 on my uncle's dairy farm outside Multan, sleeping in the spare room above the feed store where the smell of grass silage drifted through the shutters even at night. The heat never fully lifted. Even after midnight, the air felt thick enough to press against my ribs when I breathed. Most evenings ended the same way. A late meal, the dogs settling near the back steps, and the steady churn of the generator until power returned. By the fourth night, I had fallen into the farm's rhythm, waking before dawn, going to bed sore, and learning how every sound on the property carried across the fields in a way that felt both peaceful and unsettling. On the night it happened, I had been asleep only a few hours. I remember lying on top of the sheets, the ceiling fan ticking, when a heavy knock shook the door. I opened my eyes to the faint glow of the inverter bulb. It took me a moment to recognize the shape of my uncle standing in the doorway with his headlamp already on, the weak beam sliding across the sacks of feed. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I pulled on my boots and followed him down the stairs into the courtyard. The farm looked different at 3:30 a.m. The usual haze of dust was gone, and the sky stretched wide and moonless, a dark plate pressed low over the land. The kikar trees that lined the property's outer boundary stood in tall rows like thin, crooked chimneys. Their leaves barely moved, even though a warm wind pushed across the fields. Crickets filled the silence in a steady electric hum. We took the dirt track leading toward the far paddock. The path cut between two long fields of stubbled fodder corn, and each step stirred the dry earth into faint clouds that hovered around our ankles. My uncle's headlamp flickered with every bounce, throwing a cone of yellowish light that showed only the next 2 meters of ground and nothing more. Without it, we would have been walking through a black void. I kept close behind him and watched for snakes out of habit, even though the light barely reached the edges of the track. What made the walk even stranger was how awake the animals seemed. The cows in the nearest enclosure usually dozed at this hour, heavy shapes barely moving in the dark. But that night, several of them were already standing near the gate, shifting their weight, snorting, glancing toward the paddock we were headed to. Something in their posture felt wrong. They weren't restless the way they got during storms or heat spikes. They looked alert in a way I had never seen on the farm. Halfway down the track, a noise rose from the paddock ahead. At first I couldn't place it. It wasn't the deep, rolling low that cows make when they're hungry or calling to each other. These sounds were shorter, sharper, almost clipped, as if forced out too quickly. The best I can compare them to is barking. High, quick bursts that carried across the still air in uneven waves. Every time a new burst came, it seemed to ricochet between the trees and bounce back toward us. The hairs on my arms lifted. My uncle sped up, not running, but moving with the posture of someone trying not to break into a run. As we approached the gate, The beam from the headlamp shook harder because his steps were landing faster. The cows inside were pressed against the far fence, forming a tight line of bodies. Their tails were tucked, their hind legs braced, their heads turned away from the water trough at the center of the paddock. The trough was a concrete rectangle only waist high, usually full enough to reflect the sky. But in the dark, the surface looked completely black. My uncle pointed the headlamp toward it, and for a second the light dipped as if the batteries were failing. When it steadied, the beam slid over the trough and caught something pale floating right in the center. It was the head of a calf. Not a shape that resembled one, not a trick of light, an actual calf's head, skin still taut around the eyes, ears spread slightly as if caught by a breeze. The nostrils were just above the water, and the eyes were wide open, reflecting the yellowish glare from the lamp. The body wasn't there, only the head, perfectly still, perfectly centered, not drifting, not bobbing, just fixed in place as though it were anchored from below. I froze on the path. My uncle moved first, rushing toward the trough with an urgency that snapped me out of my daze. The cows flinched and shifted but didn't scatter. I expected to hear water sloshing or see the head tilt or sink, but nothing changed. The air felt heavier near the trough, carrying a faint smell of something metallic under the usual farm odors. When my uncle reached the trough, he leaned over the edge. His shoulders tensed. Then the headlamp beam twitched across the surface again, and suddenly the water was empty. Completely empty. No calf's head. No disturbance. No ripple spreading from where something had been. The surface was smooth, dark, almost glassy, as if nothing had touched it in hours. There was no blood, no hair, no shadow in the water. The trough looked like any ordinary water trough at 4 a.m. The cows' behavior shifted almost instantly. Their breathing slowed. Some stepped away from the fence and returned to grazing positions, heads down as if a switch had been flipped. The tension that had gripped the air just minutes earlier dissolved so abruptly that it left me slightly dizzy. My uncle stayed by the trough longer than I expected, scanning the ground for tracks or signs of a struggle. There was nothing. No disturbed soil, no drag marks, no prints from any animal large enough to carry off a calf whole. The only footprints belonged to the cows and us. We checked the rest of the paddock and the adjoining fence line. Every gate was locked. Every panel was upright. The dust along the perimeter showed only our boot marks and a few lines from insects. The calf that was supposed to be calving had moved closer to the center of the field and was breathing normally again. There was no sign that anything had happened. On the walk back, the darkness felt heavier than before. My uncle kept the light aimed at the path, and I walked a few steps behind him, unsure whether the strange pressure in my chest came from fear or the lingering heat. When we were almost to the courtyard, he stopped to adjust the headlamp. An instinct made me glance back toward the paddock. The trough was barely visible from that distance, just a faint rectangular gleam. As the headlamp beam skimmed across it, a small reflection flared on the water's surface. I thought it was just the angle, but then something shifted in the reflection. A second glint, a pair of bright points positioned just below the surface, aligned in a way that suggested 2 eyes looking upward. They didn't flash like a fish's movement or a trick of light on ripples. They held steady for a fraction of a second. Then they faded completely, swallowed by the dark water as if they had never been there. I didn't say anything. I couldn't tell whether what I had seen was real, or whether my mind had clung to the memory of the floating head and projected it onto the trough one last time. Exhaustion does strange things at that hour, especially when heat and darkness press in from all sides. I spent the rest of the week on the farm, and nothing else unusual happened. The cows behaved normally. No calves went missing. The trough stayed clean and ordinary. My uncle never mentioned that night again, and I never brought it up. But even now, when I think about that walk through the fields, I remember something small yet impossible to ignore. The trough wasn't deep. I had cleaned it myself earlier in the week, standing beside it, scrubbing algae from the concrete walls. It wasn't more than half a meter deep. There was nowhere for anything to hide beneath the surface. If a calf's head had sunk, I would have seen it lying at the bottom. If there had been an animal in the water, even a large fish or a snake, it would have broken the surface trying to escape. What still troubles me isn't the head itself, but the complete absence of any evidence afterward. No discolored water, no debris, no movement, just the smooth surface and the lingering possibility that for one moment, something had been watching from beneath it. Something that didn't need to remain once the light had shifted and the cows had calmed. I've convinced myself that fatigue and darkness created a perfect combination for misinterpretation. That explanation is the only one that fits the facts. Yet every time I picture the trough from that final glance back, I can still see those faint points of light fading into the water, leaving me with the unsettling certainty that whatever caused the cow's panic was real, even if it left no trace behind. It was 6:47 a.m. on October 14th, 2019, and the air outside the small room I had rented felt colder than it had any right to be. The B&B was a squat brick house separated from the nearest village by long stretches of fields and hedgerows, and the owner had warned me the night before that the area could get heavy fog in the mornings. I thought he meant the kind that blurred the horizon, maybe softened the edges of the hills. I didn't imagine the sort that thickened enough to feel like someone had dropped a curtain in front of my face. When I stepped outside to start my run, I could barely see the hedges across the lane. The moisture hung so densely in the air that each breath felt damp and faintly metallic. I set off at a slow pace, hoping the movement would warm me up. The lane behind the property was narrow, just wide enough for a single car, flanked on both sides by towering hedgerows that looked like dark, mossy walls in the fog. The road surface was uneven, little patches of loose gravel crunching under my shoes, and the cold seeped through the soles. I remember thinking that the quiet was almost too complete. Even in rural places, there's usually something, the rumble of a tractor in the distance, the call of a bird, the shift of wind against branches. But that morning, everything felt muffled, as if the fog wasn't just covering the landscape, but absorbing sound too. About a kilometer in, the silhouette of a farmhouse emerged on my right. Not all at once, but in pieces, the angled roof first, then the old stone walls, and finally the outline of a rusted tractor parked out front. The building looked abandoned at first glance, the kind of place left to weather in time, but weeds around the tractor were tamped down enough to show someone had been there recently. A scarecrow was propped against the fence that ran along the property boundary. I slowed down when I passed it, partly because I wanted to catch my breath and partly because something about it drew my eyes. It wasn't the usual kind of scarecrow with painted eyes or a crooked smile. Its head was just a burlap sack pulled over a bundle of straw and tied off at the neck. No features, no attempt at a face. The clothes were mismatched. One coat sleeve made of thick wool, the other of some thinner cotton material. Straw poked out at odd angles around the cuffs, stiff with moisture. I told myself the fog was playing tricks, making it look stranger than it really was. I adjusted my pace and kept going. The lane dipped slightly after the farmhouse, and as soon as I turned the bend, the building and scarecrow vanished back into the gray. I ran for another 10 minutes before deciding to turn around. The cold air had crept under my shirt, and the condensation in the fog made my sleeves cling to my arms. My shoes were wet along the edges from brushing against the grass lining the lane. On the way back, the farmhouse emerged again, though the fog had thickened so much that only the tractor was clear at first. When the fence came into view, I noticed the scarecrow wasn't leaning against the post where I'd seen it earlier. It was on the other side of the gate now, angled slightly toward the lane. The head seemed to be turned toward me. The burlap had no features, but the tilt gave an impression of attention, almost as if it had shifted to acknowledge my return. I stopped, not fully out of fear yet, but unsettled enough to doubt myself. Maybe I'd misremembered its position. Maybe I had been distracted the first time by the fog and the cold, and simply hadn't registered exactly where it was. I told myself that and forced my legs to keep moving. The farmhouse faded behind me once more, and I focused on the gravel under my feet, the steady rhythm of breathing, the relief of knowing I was close to being done. When the B&B finally appeared through the fog, a dim shape at first, my shoulders loosened. The gravel of the driveway stood out as a darker patch, leading toward the low, familiar outline of the building. I felt the sort of comfort people only get after walking through a place that disorients them. But that relief froze as soon as I saw the shape standing to the right of the driveway. The same sagging burlap head, the same drooping coat sleeves, the same jagged pattern of straw jutting out from one sleeve like sharp yellow fingers. The scarecrow had no reason to be there, and there were no footprints or drag marks in the wet grass leading to it. The fog had left every blade coated in beads of water, and the ground was soft enough to show even a bird's landing. But the grass around the scarecrow stood undisturbed. The owner's dog, usually a loud blur of fur that barked at anything that moved, stood about 20 meters away. Its ears were flat, and its tail was tucked so tightly toward its belly that it almost disappeared. It made a sound, not a bark, not a whine, something low and rumbling, a warning it seemed reluctant to voice. My first instinct was to look toward the house, hoping to see the owner. I raised my arm, and when I glanced back only a second later, the scarecrow was no longer by the driveway. It was closer to the front door, angled forward. The burlap sack head was tilted slightly to one side, almost as if it had turned its ear toward the dog or toward me. There was a hollow thumping in my chest, the kind that comes when your mind cycles through explanations faster than you can follow. Someone had to be moving it, but no person could have stepped out of sight that quickly without disturbing the grass or making a sound on the gravel. I wanted to run, but running felt like an invitation for something I didn't understand to give chase. Instead, I forced myself to walk toward the B&B, keeping my eyes fixed on the scarecrow. The closer I got, the more I realized small details were wrong. The sleeves were filled not just with straw, but with something heavier. The outline under the coat wasn't shapeless. The coat hung as though draped over actual arms. Not straight ones either. These had a slight bend at the elbows, as if whatever was inside had been positioned with intention. The dog backed away when I reached the front step. Its growl grew sharper, aimed directly at the scarecrow. The animal wouldn't come any nearer, which told me more than anything else that my fear wasn't imagined. Dogs don't pretend to be frightened. I went inside and locked the door. My hands were shaking so badly it took 2 tries to turn the bolt. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, warping the shapes outside. I expected the owner to come out of the kitchen at any moment, but the house stayed still. Too still. I walked from room to room until I found him in the pantry, stacking boxes of cereal. He looked up when he noticed me, but didn't ask why I looked pale, or why my shirt was damp with more than just fog. I didn't tell him immediately. I wanted to see out the window first, to confirm whether the scarecrow had followed me again. When we looked together, it was standing directly at the door, its head level with the middle window pane. The fog behind it made the burlap blur into the gray. The sleeves drooped, but the coat seemed filled out, like there was weight behind it. The owner stiffened beside me in a way that told me he wasn't playing along or trying to scare me. He stayed frozen, eyes on the figure, mouth pressed shut. The explanation came hours later, once the fog had lifted and the scarecrow was no longer at the door, but lying face down near the hedge, as if someone had dragged it there. The owner's brother, who worked odd hours and stayed in a separate cottage farther down the lane, had admitted he'd been trying to keep birds off the fields and had moved the scarecrow earlier that morning. He hadn't meant for it to wander so close to the house, but he'd left it propped near the driveway before walking to the lower field. The fog had swallowed him quickly, and he didn't realize how close he'd set it to the B&B. The owner showed me the tracks later, the faint shuffle marks where the scarecrow had been dragged, not carried. The brother had used a rope to pull it, which explained the lack of footprints. And the movement I thought I saw, that impossible shift toward the front door, was just an illusion caused by the fog and the fact that I hadn't fixed my eyes on it the entire time. A moment was enough for the blur to change shape. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't impossible. It was a mixture of poor visibility, a man trying to work quickly in heavy fog, and my own mind layering fear onto something perfectly explainable. Yet even with the truth laid out clearly, with the scarecrow lying limp and harmless in the daylight, I couldn't shake the memory of that head tilted toward the house, or the dog's refusal to go near it. The explanation made sense. I believed it, but the detail that stayed with me, and still does, was how the scarecrow looked when I passed it the first time. The way it slumped, the angle of the sleeves, the shape beneath the coat. When I saw it by the driveway, leaning forward, the posture was different in a way that didn't match what the owner's brother demonstrated later. A rope drag leaves marks, but it doesn't change the shape of what it pulls. Something about the scarecrow's stance had shifted between sightings, even though no one admitted to touching it during that gap of time. I left the next morning, the countryside bright and open under a clear sky. The hedgerows looked harmless without fog pressing against them. The farmhouse was just a farmhouse. The scarecrow was back where it belonged. But when I ran through the events again on the long train ride out of Shropshire, the one thing I knew for certain was that whatever explanation the owner's brother had offered didn't fully account for the way the scarecrow had stood, listening, as if something inside had adjusted itself by degrees. Something real, not supernatural, but alive enough to move when no one was watching. On July 18th, 2020, just after 10 at night, I was sitting alone in my cousin's farmhouse near Marden, letting a YouTube video run while I picked at a bowl of leftover rice. The farmhouse was small, one story, built in that plain, sturdy way old rural houses are. The nearest neighbor was a good kilometer away, hidden behind a line of trees. My cousin had warned me ahead of time that the place could feel empty at night, but I'd waved it off, thinking it would be a quiet break from the noise of the city. I had already spent 2 uneventful days there, watering the small vegetable patch in the morning, checking the goats, taking careless naps in the middle of the day. I'd grown so used to the isolation that I barely noticed it anymore. It felt like background silence rather than something to think about. When the power cut out, it was abrupt enough that my ears rang. The video froze on a half-lit frame, then the screen went black. The ceiling fan stopped with a heavy click. The entire house sank into a level of quiet that felt unnatural. I remember sitting there for several seconds, not moving, because the silence felt thick like it had weight. Even the insects outside seemed to cut off in the same instant. I waited for the usual surge of power returning, the hum, the flicker, but nothing happened. I picked up the torch I had left on the side table earlier and stepped outside onto the veranda. A dim yellow bulb hung over the front door, powered by a small backup battery, giving off just enough light to outline the dirt yard. Beyond that thin ring of illumination, the fields were completely black. The cornfield along the dirt track looked like a single solid wall. The air was hot, still, and smelled faintly of dust and leaves. I stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. Everything looked motionless. I aimed the torch at the yard, then over toward the well where the main breaker panel was fixed to a concrete post. As I prepared to walk over, I heard a soft tapping from the direction of the cornfield. It was faint, spaced evenly, and strangely precise. Tap, tap, tap. Not scraping, not rustling, nothing like branches or wind. More like knuckles testing a wooden surface. I froze, listening hard. The sound stopped immediately, as if whoever, or whatever, was making it had heard me shift. The corn stood completely still. I held the light on it for several seconds, but it reached only the first row of stalks, leaving every row behind them impenetrably dark. I told myself it was probably a loose metal sheet or an animal knocking something over. The mind jumps to unusual explanations when it's already late and quiet, and I tried to push the tension out of my shoulders as I stepped off the veranda. The soil under my sandals felt dry and uneven. I walked slowly toward the well, keeping the torch ahead of me. I could hear my own breathing louder than usual, and the sound of my footsteps seemed too sharp against the surrounding emptiness. The breaker panel was an old metallic box, painted a dull gray, with rust along the hinges. I opened it and shined the torch on the switches. Every switch was still in the on position. Nothing had tripped. The house should have had power. I stared at the panel for several seconds, trying to figure out what could have gone wrong. There had been no fluctuation beforehand, no warning signs. I pushed gently on a couple of the switches just in case, but they were firm. When I closed the metal door of the panel, the tapping started again. This time it came from directly behind me, so close that I felt my back tense. Tap, tap, tap. It was on the wooden well cover, not a meter away. I spun around instantly and swung the torch toward it. The round wooden cover, made of old boards nailed together, shuddered in small, twitchy movements. Not a big shake, just tiny tremors like fingertips drumming lightly from underneath or someone testing different spots to find a weak point. The movements were too controlled and too targeted to be caused by any breeze. The air was still. My first thought was an animal trapped inside, but the cover moved in a pattern that didn't fit any animal I could think of. It felt deliberate. I stepped closer, shining the light directly onto the boards. There were no fresh marks on the surface, no disturbed soil around the edges, and no sign of anything trying to climb out. My cousin had mentioned the well wasn't in use anymore and had been sealed a long time ago. The boards were thick and nailed down tightly. I crouched and listened, but the sound had stopped again the moment the torch hit it. I stood up, scanning the yard. Nothing moved. No shadows shifting, no branches shaking. The silence settled again. I tried to calm myself, telling my breathing to slow down. Maybe the cover had warped with the heat of the day and was cooling unevenly. Wood contracts, creaks, makes odd noises. I tried to believe that explanation as I backed a few steps away. Then the tapping started again, farther off toward the side wall of the house. It wasn't loud. It was barely more than the sound of fingernails clicking against thin plywood. But it moved, first against the wall near the kitchen window, then a few feet farther along, then closer again, an irregular, searching pattern. I walked briskly back to the veranda, the torch jumping in my hand. As soon as I stepped onto the boards of the veranda, the tapping followed behind me, as if keeping the same distance. I turned sharply at one point, sweeping the light across the yard, but the sound stopped instantly. The beam revealed nothing but the well, the empty yard, and the thick, silent cornrows beyond the track. I hurried to the door, feeling the tapping again, this time right against the wooden frame beside me. Light, quick taps, almost playful but not in a way that felt human. More like someone testing my awareness, pressing at the edge of my hearing. I fumbled with the key, finally got the door open, and stepped inside. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and leaned against it, trying to slow the pounding in my chest. The tapping didn't stop. It shifted to the outside surface of the door, right beside my head. Soft, steady, unmistakably deliberate. 3 taps. A pause. 2 taps. A scrape. Another tap. I backed away across the room, keeping the torch fixed on the door, though the solid would reveal nothing. The sound moved along the outside wall, heading toward the nearest window, then upward slightly, like someone was feeling along the siding. I switched off the torch, so I could listen without distraction. The darkness inside was absolute without the power. I stood there, breathing quietly, focusing on every sound. The tapping moved slowly around the house for nearly 15 minutes, shifting from wall to window frame to the lower edge of the roof. Occasionally it stopped for long stretches, and those pauses felt worse than the noise itself. The waiting was unbearable. I kept imagining someone, or something, standing inches away on the other side of the wall, listening for my movement just as I was listening for theirs. Eventually the tapping became less frequent, then faded entirely. I stayed where I was, sitting on the floor with my back to the bedroom door, and the torch pointed at the front entrance. I didn't sleep at all. Every small noise made me flinch. The fan blades above me were still frozen in place, and the heat inside the house built slowly through the night, but I didn't dare open any windows. When the first gray light of dawn finally seeped through the curtains, the fear eased just enough for me to stand. The silence outside felt different once the sun was rising, not safe, exactly, but ordinary again. I unlocked the front door and opened it carefully. The yard was empty. The dust around the well and the walls showed no footprints except my own. Even the small shutters on the well cover had left no marks. The cornfield was motionless under the early morning breeze. Later that day, a technician from the power company came and did a full inspection. He found a broken line on the pole near the road, something that could have happened from storm stress or metal fatigue over time. He said the failure would have caused a clean cutoff, just like the one I'd experienced. The tapping, though, he had no explanation for that. He told me there were no animals in the area that would approach a house like that at night, certainly none that would tap on walls or follow a person around a yard. I didn't tell him how close the taps had been, or how they had moved with me from the well to the veranda, tracking me like a shadow. When my cousin returned 2 days later, I tried to describe what happened, but even I could hear how strange it sounded out loud. The details felt too precise, too calculated, as if someone had been testing the house, testing the well, testing the walls, and testing me. My cousin checked around the property and shrugged, saying it was probably loose wood, temperature shifts, or my imagination running wild in the dark. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was all just a coincidence of sounds amplified by the silence and my isolation. But even now, years later, I can still remember the rhythm of those taps, the measured pressure on the well cover, the way they stopped instantly when the torch light hit, the way they returned the moment I turned away. I left the farmhouse early that morning and never stayed there alone again. It was 5:12 p.m. on March 3rd, 2021, when I found myself farther from home than I meant to be, riding a narrow farm road outside Sialkot at an hour when the light turns weak and the air starts holding that cold smell that comes before fog. The plan had been simple: get to the village before the call to Maghrib, check on a friend's property, and head back while there was still enough daylight to see the ruts and loose gravel that always collected near the irrigation canals. I had done this ride countless times, and the road, despite being little more than cracked asphalt squeezed between wheat fields, felt familiar in the way you trust a place you've grown up around. But the season had been wet, the canals full and muddy, and the wheat had shot up faster than usual, forming tall, shifting walls on both sides that blocked whatever breeze was trying to move through the fields. It made the road feel narrower than I remembered, like it had been swallowed. For the last kilometer, my bike's headlight had been flickering just enough to make me curse the wiring job I had been meaning to fix for months. Every few seconds, it dimmed for a heartbeat, then steadied again. I kept telling myself it was nothing serious, that I only had a short way left, and the fog wouldn't settle so early in March. But the sky was already flattening into that dull, colorless light that feels like the day is holding its breath. I hunched forward, urging the bike to carry me just a little farther before the road became a strip of darkness between two indistinguishable fields. The final flicker was longer than the rest. The bulb blazed once, a sharp white burst, then went completely dead. The engine kept running, but without the headlight the road dissolved under me. I slowed immediately, feet brushing the rough edges of asphalt, and let the bike roll to a stop beside a small concrete culvert that carried water from the canal under the road. The air around me felt unnervingly still, except for the faint ticking of the cooling engine and the distant, irregular barking of dogs somewhere in the direction of the village. I tried restarting the headlight twice, but nothing happened. Even the speedometer light had gone out. I told myself I'd use my phone's flashlight and walk the bike the remaining distance, but the idea of moving through that narrowing twilight with only a small beam of white in front of me made my stomach tighten. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Its glow felt strangely bright in the near darkness, almost intrusive against the muted evening. Before I could turn it toward the road, I heard a sound that didn't match anything I expected to hear out there. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the dry wheat. Not rushing, not stumbling, but placed one after the other with a rhythm that matched the pace I had been moving before I stopped. The steps stayed parallel to the road, maybe 2 meters into the field, hidden by the height of the stalks. I listened, trying to filter the sound from the soft rustling of the plants, and for a moment I convinced myself it was just a farmer heading home late. When I lifted the phone to shine toward the wheat, the footsteps stopped. Completely. The sudden silence felt heavier than the sound itself. I moved the beam slowly across the wall of stalks, expecting to catch a glimpse of fabric or a face between the plants, but there was nothing except the uneven movement of wheat shifting in the small breeze. I lowered the light, telling myself not to react to every little thing, and that was when something exhaled right against my ear. Warm, wet, impossibly close. I spun so fast I nearly dropped the phone. The road behind me, the canal, the culvert, even the faint rise of farmland beyond. Everything was empty. No person, no bike passing by, nothing that could explain breath that close to my skin. I felt the hairs on my neck lift in a slow wave. My pulse thudded in my jaw, and I held my breath without meaning to, waiting for a sign that what I felt had a real, understandable source. The footsteps started again, not in the same place. Now they moved in a slow curve through the wheat, circling me from one side of the road to the other. The sound barely rose above the rustle of dry stalks brushing against each other, but it was unmistakable. Something or someone was moving in an arc around me, staying just deep enough in the field to remain hidden. Each step bent the wheat slightly before releasing it. I watched the thin line of movement shift, faint but visible if I concentrated on the places where the plants leaned and straightened. My first thought was that it had to be someone playing a prank, maybe a teenager from a nearby farmhouse. But the fields there were wide, and the nearest homes were far enough that I couldn't imagine anyone bothering to hide themselves this way at dusk with no guarantee of being seen. The pattern of movement wasn't playful. It didn't speed up or slow down. It didn't hesitate. It just kept circling, careful and patient, always out of sight. I tried to call out, but the words stuck in my throat, caught somewhere between fear and the absurdity of talking into an empty field. Instead, I tightened my grip on the phone, feeling the heat of the small device against my palm. When the steps came closer, the wheat near the road parted in a way that made a thin, dark line between the stalks. I couldn't see whoever, or whatever, caused it, but the bending of the plants was unmistakable. I felt a creeping sensation in my limbs, like my body understood something before my mind did. The narrowing circle wasn't random. It was deliberate, measured. The sound shifted behind me again, and for a heartbeat I thought I heard breathing threaded into the footsteps, but it was too faint to trust my own senses. I backed away from the culvert and put one hand on the bike's handlebar, meaning to push it forward, but the thought of moving slowly down the road while something tracked me through the wheat made my chest tighten. The path ahead looked impossibly long, the village lights distant smudges in the thickening haze. Every instinct I had told me to leave the bike and run. The circling steps pressed closer, the rustling sharper, as if whatever moved through the field had shortened the distance, and was now only a few paces away from breaking through the edge onto the road. I didn't wait to see if it would. I let go of the bike, turned toward the direction of the lights, and ran with a speed I didn't know my legs could manage over uneven ground. The phone's beam bounced wildly, catching glimpses of the road, the imperfect edges, and the shifting wheat that seemed to lean toward the asphalt as I passed. For the first 50 meters, I could still hear the footsteps in the field, matching my pace the way they had when I was standing still. That steady rhythm felt impossibly controlled, as though the thing moving didn't need to crash through the stalks or force its way to keep up. It moved with the same calm, steady speed, and the sound didn't fade until I put enough distance between myself and the culvert that all I could hear was my own breathing and the thudding in my ears. I didn't look back, not once. The village lights grew brighter, and the road widened and smoothed as I approached the first cluster of homes. By the time I reached the edge of the settlement, the fog had finally started forming in thin, trailing sheets across the fields, softening all shapes behind me. Even then, I didn't turn. I didn't want to know if the wheat behind me was still moving. When I finally stopped, bent over with my hands on my knees, the sound of distant evening routines drifted around me. Metal pans clattering, a goat bleating, a motorcycle starting somewhere out of sight. Everything was normal, completely ordinary. It made the memory of the footsteps feel like something separate from the world I knew. But I told myself over and over that nothing supernatural had happened, that there had to be an explanation grounded in the same reality as the road and the fields and the barking dogs. Fear amplifies everything. Weak carry sounds strangely. Low light distorts distance and direction. I repeated these thoughts as I walked home, forcing my breathing to slow. Later that night, after I had borrowed a ride back to retrieve the bike, the field was silent. No footprints in the wheat, no broken stalks near the culvert. The road looked exactly as it always had. The only sign that anything had happened was my dead headlight and the churned dust where my shoes had dug in when I ran. The rest was just air, silence, and the knowledge that whatever moved through that field had chosen not to show itself. Whether it was a person, an animal, or something I misinterpreted in the rising fog, the fact that it stayed hidden felt more unsettling than anything I might have seen.